Good day. My name is KEEFtalk. This is my email address, and that's my Twitter address, which I use all the time. Today is May 2020, and I'm sad to say that we've spent about 2 months now in lockdown, and the concerns about the virus are not abating. But it's time for me to focus upon something which has been a passion of mine for about 45 years, ever since I started teaching in 1974. And that is to try to look at what education we should be having to prepare our young people to achieve good health, well-being and life chances. This chaos that we've got at the moment, crisis that we've got at the moment, is an opportunity perhaps for other people to think about way in which we could start to change our education system. If you've seen some of the others, I've tried to explain why our schools are like they are. I began going to school, this is me with my brother, 50 plus years ago. I began going to school in 1957, a hell of a long time ago. Both my primary and secondary schools were basically the same as my parents had about 50 years prior to that. So for at least 100 years we've had the situation where we've had this sort of thing in place. As you can see, for primary schools and in secondary schools, we start school basically at the age of about 4 or 5, and then switch to secondary school at the age of 11. We usually start in September. We used to have 6 weeks holiday, still do, school day 9 to 4, pupils placed in year groups, and as you got older, so you went up. We were taught in classrooms in my day, and in my parents' day in groups of about 30, 35, perhaps even a bit more than that. The teachers were focused much more upon each subject, and even in primary schools we had different sorts of subjects being taught at various parts of the day, and the subjects were being taught English, maths, science, geography, history. And as I went to secondary school in 1963, we had lessons which lasted about an hour. You'll see they have now. And we moved from one classroom to the next in secondary school, much as we do now. We had different teachers teaching us different subjects in secondary school, much as they do now. We had homework given to us, much as my parents did and as they do now. We were given written exams various times, in my day quite a bit, but certainly at the end of the year, as they are now, and they had national exams in May and June, much as they are now. Those exams were basically very important. O-levels in my day, GCSE a little bit later on, and A-levels when you were 18, no different there. And basically when I went to secondary school, we had to have quite an expensive school uniform. It seemed very expensive to us because we didn't have very much money. So basically it's clear that schools have remained virtually unchanged for about 100 years. However, there's been a huge amount of evidence over the last 50 years to say that they should be changing their priorities. And these are some of the things which you may have come across. First of all, you've seen me explain that the World Health Organization clearly feel that we should be focusing upon developing our person's individual characteristics and behaviours, or as I call them, skills. You has your pick, takes your choice. The OECD, which is the international group dealing with education these days, have come up with something for the last 20-30 years, that the skills that students need to contribute effectively to society are actually constantly changing. They're not the same as they were 100, 150 years ago, but as I've seen there, OECD agree with me, they look much the same schools as we did years ago. And teachers, when they were teaching me in the 60s, seem to be much the same as they are these days, despite the fact that there needs to be a huge change. Ever since I began teaching in the 70s, as my children had very good O-level and then A-level results, I used to hear criticism from the CBI saying, look, these people are very good at passing exams, but actually they're not very good whether they're A-level or even graduates, because these are the skills that we really want from our employees. It's also important to see that in recent years, in the last 20 years, lots of research, lots of reports, often organised by the governments, have come up with basically these sort of areas are the things that we should be focusing upon because they determine the future of our children. So in 2005 we had quite a radical change following Every Child Matters and the disasters that we had then, to focus upon these particular areas. These there, they had slightly different names, but otherwise these were the things that it was decided when the children were very young we should be focusing upon. The difficulty is that those are the same skills that we need when we're adults. So as to why we don't focus upon them afterwards is quite strange. And in fact in 2009 we started to have quite major changes to look at how we could shift our education system so that we could focus much more upon developing these particular skills. They were called, or the most important document, if you've never come across it, Your Child, Your Schools, Our Future, Building the 21st Century School System. I must admit at that time I became quite optimistic that finally in my lifetime we would actually have a change in the schools. We had a general election in 2010, everything changed. So consequently, we've had since then, because there's been such a campaign, in various times, this government has actually focused upon character resilience. Basically, they're talking about advocating these, but not changing the school system to accommodate it. 5 years ago, a person who I've got a lot of time for, Dr. Anthony Seldon, he basically advocated that it's these skills that we should be focusing upon. And the reason he was maintaining that public schools, independent schools, were doing so well was not because their exam results were that good. They are quite good, but so are they in state schools, but because they spend so much time developing these skills. One of the things which we now need to consider is what are we presently doing? Now I have asked these questions for 30 to 40 years. I've been writing school reports since 1974, and also job specifications, references. Goodness knows how many hundreds and hundreds of references I've written. I've written umpteen, again hundreds, university entrance statements and had to scan through them. Early years profiles I've already showed you, and leadership skills, which I could deal with in a great deal in another KEEFtalk. All of those, what are they after? What are they assessing? What are they measuring? These things over here. And the bizarre thing is that our education system still seems to be dominated by exams, as though that's the be all and end all. So clearly this 2020 is time for us to consider what it is we're going to try to do to shift from where we are with our education system to where we need to be. And the way in which we can do this is relatively simple and straightforward. I began doing this in the late 80s, 30 plus years ago. And all it was I started to make sure scientifically that I could begin to assess these skills on my children. So I created, it took a long time, and you've seen that in the previous KEEFtalk, ways in which we can identify those skills that we've got up here that really matter. Because when I had to write references, when I had to do these university entrance, etc., I needed to have a way which I felt confident that I could focus upon that. So consequently, what I then did was throughout the 90s studied and taught many different subjects. I was lucky enough to be in a school where they allowed me to do that. And I was able to get a different approach, or perhaps an analytical approach, of what the subjects are about. Science is straightforward for me because that's my background, that's what my degree's in. Maths, again, very simple, taught that umpteen times. That's my great strength perhaps when I was a pupil, and I've taught it for many years. English, I was married once to an English teacher, so I had the opportunity at great length to analyse what this subject was about, and you will see that it's actually about much more than just spelling, punctuation and grammar. Outstanding subject, but misunderstood. History, one of my great passions now, and has been for many years, because it's so useful. we've seen now with the 2020 crisis that we're replicating stuff that happened almost 100 years ago. Whether we've learnt from that or not is arguable. And it started over in China. So understanding how this global thing has expanded, of course geography is brilliant for that sort of analysis. For me, one of the great things was I began as a PE teacher, and then we didn't have exams in those. It was one of the great strengths, but we used to do lots of assessments, and you can see the different subjects that we've got there have so much potential, so great in developing these skills, but sadly we don't tend to assess them accurately, scientifically enough. A few years ago I came across this book by Paul Tough, where he did an analysis in America of the KEEP schools, the Knowledge is Power schools, and they are doing something fairly similar to what I've been doing for 20 years prior to that. And I would advocate that you look into that because it's very useful. For me, for 30 years, the way in which we can shift our schools to where we are, to where they need to be, is basically for the subjects initially to start to analyse what really matters in the development of these skills and assess our students. The parents absolutely love this, the students love this, because they could understand what they really needed to focus upon rather than just worrying about the individual subjects. As an attempt to try to convey how important all this is, and I'm not very good at writing, but perhaps you might say I'm not very good at presenting or teaching, but I tried to write a book where basically I outlined just an idea where a child like me struggled in normal school, went to a school where they adopted a healthy new style and they focused upon health and well-being. I finished now. I hope that's whetted your appetite. I hope you go away and look at some more KEEFtalks. Thank you very much.